What's up, guys? Welcome to Getting Fish. My name is Jax. Today is the first video in the beginner bass fishing series, and so I'm going to be going over the biology of the bass, their behavior, preferences, and stuff like that with you. So without further ado, let's get into it. And so when I say bass fishing, when most people refer to bass fishing, what they're talking about is fishing for black bass, and especially modern day, it's referred to like tournament style angling, which is using artificial lures to catch bass and not using so much live bait. And usually, a lot of bass fishermen aren't keeping the bass to eat. They're doing it for recreation, for sport, just to have a great time and prove themselves there out in the water as well. And so, the biology of the bass, when I say bass, I'm breaking it down into basically one group. It's called the black bass family. Now I'm going to post a picture up on the screen here of all the fish in the black bass family, and there's three main ones that come into play, and that's the spotted bass, the smallmouth bass, and the largemouth bass. And probably the most common is the largemouth bass. Second would be smallmouth, and then like the third most common is spotted bass. The others are very rare, and they only occur in certain bodies of water throughout North America and the rest of the United States, and in fact the world. And so for this video, I'm going to be talking mostly about largemouth, smallmouth, and spotted bass. But for me, I mostly target largemouth and smallmouth bass. There's really not any bodies of water around where I live in eastern Pennsylvania that have spotted bass in them. And so while most of the information will apply to all three, they do have some differences and preferences in their biology, obviously. And so yeah, that's basically the bass summed up. And so I guess we'll go into sort of some of their behaviors and preferences, and when you're as it relates to fishing as well. So when you're trying to fish for bass and you're trying to catch them, there's a few ways to make them strike. The first way is to trigger their feeding response, and so that's obviously mimicking their prey, which is like the most common way people think about it to catch fish. And so that's one of the most common ways it's just one of the best ways to catch them. But the other two would be sort of their defense mechanism, because every spring the bass will move up shallow and they'll spawn. They'll create beds, they'll fan away debris off the bottom, and they'll lay their eggs on the bottom of the lake, pond, or river. And they will defend that area like vigorously. They'll really defend that area. So when you fish around their beds, they don't like your lures around the beds, because it could be smaller fish trying to eat their eggs and stuff like that, and so they'll bite your lure when you put it on their beds a lot of times. And so that's a whole rabbit hole you can go down, and it's a very advanced thing. But just the basic idea of the spawn is something that every bass angler should understand, and that happens during the spring of the year, and it's one of the best times as far as times of the year to go bass fishing is in the spring during the spawn. And so that's sort of their one of their prime behaviors that you should know. That's the first thing you should know as a bass angler, really. And so the third way to trigger a bass to strike is by a reaction strike. Now, a reaction strike is most often caused by the bait moving back past them very fast. So you're going to use a fast-moving lure and work it, like I said, fast, and it will trigger them into striking it. And so there's a couple ways to do that, and I'll get more into that in the other videos, and it's a whole rabbit hole to go down. So this is the first video, so I'm just going to stick to the basics, and that's the basics of bass behavior. Something I may have should have talked about earlier is their location, and that can be determined by a bunch of things, but just in generic, their location. They're found basically throughout all of North America. So largemouth bass are found throughout the entire North America. Smallmouth, they typically like cooler waters, and they tend to stay more up north. And so that's what I fish for a lot. I fish for a lot of smallmouth, but I do fish for largemouth almost about the same amount that I do for smallmouth. And so they're both very fun species to catch. So the difference between largemouth and smallmouth is largemouth, obviously, they have a larger mouth. And so the way to tell them biologically apart is the smallmouth's mouth won't extend past their eye, and the largemouth's mouth will extend past their eye when their mouth is closed. And so that's the main way to tell the difference. But typically smallmouth tend to be brown in color, and largemouth tend to be greenish color. As well as that, largemouth, they prefer to live in weedier environments, and Smallmouth prefer rock. Now that's not general. Smallmouth will live in the grass and largemouth will hang out around rock. But in general, they tend to separate in those types of ways. Also, smallmouth prefer deeper and colder water. So they're found more commonly up north than they are down south. And largemouth, vice versa, they prefer the warmer water, and so they're found pretty commonly down south and somewhat less commonly, although they're still very plentiful in the north. And so that's the difference between those two main species that I'm talking about. And where are all these species found? Basically, any freshwater ponds, lakes, or rivers. You can do research based on your state and the bodies of water in your area. Just by going to your state Fish and Game or Fish and Boat Commission website, you can do research on which species are in which lake based on where you live. And so, typically, if it's a large lake, there's a good chance largemouth and smallmouth will be in them, at least for around where I live. And then rivers too, and then ponds around me, at least where I live, it's mostly largemouth bass. And so largemouth is the main species I'm talking about, but smallmouth applies to a lot of what I'm saying as well. And so yeah, that's basically where they live. But there's also, as far as what bodies of water they live in, you can go deeper and talk about the types of places they like to hang out in the water. And so I guess that's what we're going to go into next. And so there's two different types of places where bass like to hang out. There's structure and there's cover. So structure is the contour of the lake and the shape of the bottom of the lake. And so there's a bunch of different types of structure. And so one example would be a point. So where the bottom is a little bit higher in an area and it comes to a point and then it's lower off to the sides and off the end. And so that's called a point. Fish will hang out in those. There's also humps where it's literally just a raised part on the lake, or an island top is what they're sometimes called. And so it's just a raised portion of the bottom. Okay, so I just told you about the hump, and then I guess, let's see, there's also things called ledges and creek channels and a bunch of other things that can be discussed much further in a later video. And then as far as the types of cover, so cover is non-structural, like non-related to the contour. So some examples of, much easier if I just tell you the examples of cover. So for cover, you have things like wood, rocks, docks, vegetation, all those things that provide shade or places to hide for the fish, and those are called cover. And so generally, bass will hang around those types of areas more than just roaming open water. And so you want to fish places like the bank and places with rocks, trees, grass, all that stuff. And you can go into a lot of detail as far as that stuff too. But that's the basic gist. Fish around areas like that, and you should be able to catch a few fish. So I think that's going to be it for this video. Thank you for watching. In the next video, I'm going to be discussing what bass eat, what lures you should use to fish for them, and yeah, I'm just going to be going a little bit further into it in that video. And so if you're enjoying this series so far, make sure you leave a like, send it to a friend, subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you later.